Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. I really feel with that theme music, what should happen now is the curtains should close, part, and we should be watching the movie, the Legislative Council, the movie, perhaps first part of the trilogy or the third part, second part. But no, we're here for day 2 of the conference, 200 years young today, visions for our democratic future as we imagine the future of parliamentary democracy. I don't really have anything to let you know in a housekeeping sense. We've got 2 informative sessions coming up, one after another, and then we break for morning tea at 11 a.m. To introduce our first speaker this morning, can I welcome the Honourable Chris Rath, MLC, to the stage. Mr. Rath is a member of the Liberal Party, the Opposition Whip in the Legislative Council, and Shadow Special Minister of State. He has a chapter published in the book The Forgotten People, Updated Liberal Essays on Modern Australia, and he enjoys marathon running, sailing, skiing, opera, free market economics, history, and of course politics. Please join me in welcoming the very well-rounded Chris Rath.
Thanks, David. And of course, you too enjoy marathon running. And I'm not just talking about the marathon sittings in the Legislative Council we're often subjected to. But honestly, thank you, David and President Ben Franklin and all of the staff here at the Parliament for making this conference possible. I'd like to welcome back Professor Rodney Smith, who gave a fascinating recount of the history of the Legislative Council 1924 to 2024 yesterday morning. Today, Professor Smith will be asking us to consider the rather controversial question, do we need more members of Parliament? Rodney Smith is a Professor of Australian Politics at the University of Sydney. He is also a former president of the Australian Political Studies Association. He has written academic articles, chapters and books on aspects of New South Wales politics, including the Legislative Council. And notably, he is the author of the book Against the Machines, Minor Parties and Independents in New South Wales 1910 to 2006, and is a co-editor of the book From Carr to Keneally, Labor in Office in New South Wales 1995 to 2011. Please join me in welcoming back Professor Rodney Smith.
Well, thank you, Chris, and it's nice to be back. I think I was invited back to give a bit of a provocation this morning to wake people up on the second day. And I think this idea originated some years ago when I made some rather more off-the-cuff remarks about the possibility of increasing the number of parliamentarians in the New South Wales Parliament, which, as I recall, went down like a lead balloon last time I presented it in front of mostly then current and former members of the Legislative Council. But maybe it'll get a better reception this morning. Who knows? We can live in hope. So let me just going to check that. Yeah, cool. So the slides are working. I'd like to start off by talking about one of the joys of my academic life, which is teaching a unit of study at the University of Sydney called Parliament and Democracy. And it's a third-year unit, an upper-level unit, so the students have done a little bit of politics. They're a little bit advanced in their studies, and as part of that unit, we engage with the New South Wales Parliament. We come down on 4 occasions during the semester in lieu of lectures, and Chris Rath was actually kind enough to participate in one of those sessions this semester. And I try and make it as practical as possible, this unit. Not theoretical, not abstract, some comparative stuff, but what I want the students to do is to engage with the real parliament and learn how a real parliament works. And so one of the assessments that I ask the students to do is to write an opinion piece for the conversation on whether or not the Legislative Council should be abolished. And they don't publish it, but they write it as if it's a conversation piece. They have to learn the style of the conversation, with which I'm sure you're familiar, and present it in that way. And if you are a supporter of the Legislative Council, you'll be happy to hear that this year, of 41 submissions, 39 supported retention of the council. Two bold souls argued for its abolition, name them, yes, mostly on grounds of efficiency, but for the vast majority of students, perhaps they were picking up my lead, I don't know, but they were supportive of the retention of the Legislative Council with some improvements. And that was part of the brief too. If they wanted to say, yes, keep the Legislative Council but improve it, that was perfectly fine. So that was the first assessment. And then the final assessment I get them to do is to suggest reforms to the New South Wales Parliament, to suggest a reform that would make the New South Wales Parliament contribute more strongly than it currently does to democracy in New South Wales. And it's up to them what they choose. And it was interesting this year, there's always a range of responses to this, and this year there were quite a few on changing the electoral system. There were a number on reserved seats for First Nations peoples in New South Wales. There were a number on shifting to a virtual parliament or a hybrid parliament where more activities were done online, and I think we'll hear more about that later today, and so on. The ones that looked specifically at the kind of functions of Parliament focused on improving the committee system, dealing with petitions more effectively to give people feedback on what they thought was wrong with politics in New South Wales or a particular issue and so on. And most of that involved setting up a petitions committee along the lines of the Western Australian Parliament or the Scottish version of that petitions committee and so on. Or setting up, restructuring the committee system so that it was more attuned to protecting or considering the protection of people's rights and liberties. So what you might pick up from that is that nobody was arguing that the Legislative Council should do less or the Legislative Assembly should do less. Most of the arguments were about either restructuring different aspects of the Legislative Council and the Legislative Assembly or making them do more or recognising that they should be doing more. And so this is the kind of starting point for my suggestion, this idea that when a group of educated, thoughtful, reflective students at the University of Sydney think about the Parliament, they don't think, no, it should be doing less, it should be getting out of the way of the executive or the bureaucracy or whatever. They think it should actually be doing more than it does. They don't think it does a bad job, but they think it should be doing more of a good job. So in many ways this mirrors, I think, the increase in the work of the Parliament and especially the Legislative Council in recent decades. If you look back over the past few decades of the Legislative Council, it is indeed doing more than it used to do. The Parliament as a whole is doing more. The Legislative Council, I think, particularly so. And we expect more as citizens of our New South Wales Parliament. And that's partly because the executive, governments do more than they used to. I mean, some people might not like that. You know, if you're a kind of a libertarian or a small government person, person who thinks that society and markets can sort things out, that's a bad thing. But I'm not making this as a normative statement. I'm just reflecting on the fact that governments do more than they once did. And if Parliament's functions are to deal with legislation, keep executives accountable, then the more executives do, the more legislation they try to put through the Parliament, the more activities they engage in as the executive, the more we must expect parliaments do to keep those executives accountable and to properly scrutinise legislation. So that's the kind of starting point for this proposal. that we might think about increasing the number of members of Parliament, and specifically the Legislative Council, although also the Legislative Assembly, in order that the Parliament be able to carry out this task even more effectively than it does. And it's clear that there are new areas of government, new areas in which government is interested and the Parliament is interested that once would not have been considered a topic worthy of the Parliament or the Executive's consideration. I take as an example a recent or current actually inquiry in New South Wales, which was established in August this year, in which the Standing Committee on Social Issues of the Legislative Council was given the responsibility to inquire into, and I quote, the prevalence, causes and impacts of loneliness in New South Wales. And if you think about that and think about 100 years ago, no way would the Parliament of New South Wales be considering that sort of topic. It's a new topic, maybe even 30 years ago, 20 years ago. It's a new topic, a new area of inquiry, a new area of interest, a new social problem with which the Executive and the Parliament are engaged. Now that inquiry's attracted 143 submissions. I haven't read them all, I've read some of them, they're very interesting, including as one idea that there should be, I think this got some media coverage, a Minister for Loneliness established in this state. Well, if we're going to have a Minister for Loneliness, and again, I'm not suggesting that this is a good or a bad thing, but it implies more accountability on behalf of the Parliament as the Ministry yet again expands its portfolio responsibilities. Now, to give a broader picture of this activity by the Legislative Council and the demands on MLCs, members of the Legislative Council, I just want us to consider the Legislative Council's committee work for the moment. And remember, there are 42 members of the Legislative Council. There are 5 ministers. I hope I get all these figures correct. Someone will... 6 ministers. Okay, 6 ministers in the Legislative Council. So you've got to take them out of the equation because ministers don't sit on committees. There's the President who sits on one committee. So you've got to take more or less the President out of the equation. So you can start doing the maths in your head. We're now down to 35 MLCs who are available for committee work. And the committees are structured along partisan lines in a complicated way that I'm not going to attempt to summarise, but it puts particular responsibilities on, I think, the party of government. So at the moment, the Labor Party, again, someone will yell out if I'm wrong, has 15 MLCs. You take out 6 of them, you've got 9 MLCs available to carry out that committee work. Or think of the crossbench. The crossbench is large, but it is represented on most of these committees. Think of the poor old opposition. It's about a third of the number of MLCs, and it is represented on all of these committees. There's a lot of work, and let me just demonstrate that. As I say, I won't entirely vouch for these numbers. I tried to be as careful as I could be, but I may have left some out. So at the moment, I think the figures are something like this. So that I don't turn around, let me read them from one of my crib sheets, which I've lost. Here we go. A bit like Anthony Green up here. Okay. So there are 5 select committees, at least since, there have been 5 select committees in the 58th Parliament since March 2023, on birth, trauma, disability support, PFAS, Rosehall Racecourse, renewable energy. In total, that's 39 Legislative Council members. There are 9 standing committees: Law and Justice, State Development, Social Issues, Animal Welfare, Privileges, Procedure, Public Accountability and Works, Regulation, Selection of Bills. That's 86 members in total. There are the 8 portfolio committees that we talked about yesterday, on and off. I haven't listed them all there, but starting with Premier and Finance number 1 and going all the way through to Customer Service number 8, which also operate as estimates committees, which we heard a little bit about yesterday afternoon from our MLCs. total of 56. There are 4 joint committees with the Legislative Assembly, of which the Legislative Council provides 18 members of the 37. There are 7 joint statutory committees, 22 of the 55 members of those. They're the ones that oversee the Ageing and Disability Commissioner and the ICAC Commissioner and so on and so forth. There are 3 joint select committees, 13 of 29 members. So the grand total down the bottom there is the grand total of 36 committees, 234 members required in the Legislative Council. And I've got that wrong because I've said 37 available MLCs. It's 36 and 35, excluding the President. So that's a lot of work. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of serious work. Now, I'm not saying that those committees run all the time and they're equally active all the time. I know there are, peaks and troughs. But we're expecting a lot just in that committee work of our members of the Legislative Council in particular. More work is being done by the same number of members since 1991, when the 42-member Legislative Council was established, and with reduced numbers compared with most of the history of the Legislative Council. So my next table shows a little bit of that history. I'm not a historian, so I may have selected figures that suit me. I haven't actually. You could select a different set of dates and you'd come up with more or less the same story. If we go back right to the start, I know the first Legislative Council wasn't representative, had 5 members, but the ratio of members to population was 1 member for 7,300 residents of the colony who counted. I know there's exclusions there around Indigenous Australians who were not counted in that total, but 1 to 7,300. Then if we go to the period of that Frank talked about yesterday, when the council was appointed by the governor, and the premiers sort of kept suggesting to governors that they should add more members when they didn't have enough who agreed with them. Over time, the membership fluctuates, and the membership relative to the population fluctuates. And so here I've got the membership at the start of the Parks Ministry, first Parks Ministry, Henry Parks in 1872, 36 MLCs, 1 MLC for 14,000 roughly residents. By the end of Parks's fourth ministry in 1889, it's up to 86 members of the Legislative Council. You can see why the chamber for the Legislative Council might have been a bit crowded in those days if they all turned up. And the population is a little bit over 1 million, 1,100,000, so it's 1 for every 13,000. So during that period, the ratio roughly stays the same if you look at that sort of column second from the right. 1933, the first indirectly elected Legislative Council, 60 members, 2.6 million people counted in New South Wales. It goes up again, 1 member for every 43,000 roughly New South Wales people. I'm not talking about voters here, I'm talking about people. And then if we look at the first directly elected Parliament in Legislative Council rather in 1978, 45 members, 4.8 million residents of New South Wales, and we're now over 100,000 people in New South Wales per MLC. And the ratio gets higher from there. So 1991, the current council begins, 42 members, 5.1 million people in New South Wales, gives you 1 MLC for 120-odd thousand New South Welsh people. That's following the reduction in council numbers from 45. And then if we look at the current situation, second from the bottom, 42 MLCs still, 8.5 million people. So 1 member of the Legislative Council notionally is looking after 202,000 odd people. And to telegraph my modest proposal, if we went to a council of 60, that would be reduced to 1 in 141,000. So a little bit worse ratio than 1991, but around then. So the situation then is that the Legislative Council is doing more work, representing more people with the same numbers of members since 1991 and fewer than for most periods in terms of ratio and often in terms of absolute numbers. If you look at that first column, you've got to go back really to the 1870s to find smaller councils, which is a long time ago when the population of New South Wales was a lot smaller than it is now. And it's the same for the Legislative Assembly. I don't want to leave them out of things, just running through quickly the same sorts of figures. So 1856, 56 MPs, 250 odd thousand in the population. That's one member of the Legislative Assembly, one member of Parliament, MP, for every 6,000 and a bit people. And then it goes down. Why does it go down in 1859? Grows a bit to 80, and then it goes down to 72 because Queensland becomes a separate colony, gets its own parliament, and so wisely the New South Wales lawmakers think, well, we don't need such a big parliament now that we're representing fewer people. But then in the late 19th century, at least between 1880 and 1894, there's an increase almost all the time from 108 members of the Legislative Assembly up to 141, and this reflects the growth in electoral roll numbers. So the electoral roll grows. Sorry, again, I've used population there rather than the electoral roll, but they pretty much grow in tandem. And the ratio of MPs to the population stays reasonably close. Starts at about 1 in 7,000 and finishes about 1 in 8,000. So it's reasonably close. Big growth in the number of MPs over that period, 108 to 141, but the ratio stays reasonably contained. 1904 goes back to 90 MPs, 90 members of the Legislative Assembly. Why does that happen? Because there's a Commonwealth Parliament now, and so the rationale is, well, the Commonwealth's taking over these responsibilities. They're doing some of the heavy lifting that used to be done by the New South Wales government and the New South Wales Parliament. We don't need as many parliamentarians in New South Wales, so we can cut back the numbers. And you see there the ratio is still more than it was in the late 19th century, but it's still relatively low. Fast forward 1988, when the most recent peak in numbers occurs, and that's at the end of the Unsworth government, 1988, 109 MPs are elected, and the population is 5.7 million, and you see there one member of Parliament for every 52,000 people. Now from here on in, there are a couple of changes. There's a change in, I've forgotten the date, but the last change is 1999, so I'm going to say when was the previous one? 1995? And these were basically for party advantage. So the Unsworth government knew it was in trouble, changed the number of electorates to try and minimise the damage, create a whole lot of new electorates, new electoral boundaries, try and change the electoral equation. Didn't help them, got wiped out. The Greiner government comes in, and then the numbers are reduced and reduced again to 99, and then reduced again by the Carr government. Current situation, 2024, 93 members of the Legislative Assembly still, population much bigger, another 2 million people, and so the ratio now is 1 to a little over 90,000 people. If you increased the Legislative Assembly to 121, it would bring it down to 1 in 70,000 odd. So it would be back where it was in 1999, roughly. Okay, so that's just a kind of a bit to put things into context, to suggest there's no magic number for the Legislative Assembly or the Legislative Council, that the numbers have varied, the ratios have varied. Generally speaking, the ratios have grown larger. So these changes, this growth in the ratio of population to number of members of the New South Wales Parliament indicate some valid reasons for increasing the numbers of both chambers. Representation, harder to represent more and more people. I understand that these days communication channels have changed, of course. We're no longer in the horse and buggy days or the telegraph days or days of putting a letter in the post or whatever, but we're also no longer in the days of large public meetings and gatherings and so on. People joining associations and meeting up in person. So it's unclear how much really has changed in that regard, what the connections between MPs and their citizens are relative to the past. They've certainly changed, but it strikes me that representation is a problem for parliaments, not just the New South Wales Parliament, but parliaments in other jurisdictions in Australia. But to return to my first theme, it also strikes me that in terms of the legislative and governmental responsibilities of the Parliament, that the numbers aren't big enough relative to those responsibilities. So my modest proposal is for, as I foreshadowed, a Parliament which would consist of 121 members of the Legislative Assembly and 60 members of the Legislative Council. And you can take a modest proposal in the sort of Swiftian vein, or you can take it that I'm serious. It's up to you to work out which one it is. But let's get down to some practicalities. How would we elect such a Legislative Council? Legislative Assembly is relatively clear. You just draw 121 electoral boundaries and there you go. But with the Legislative Council, things are slightly more complex. I think there are three main options. There are some others, but I don't think they'd be acceptable. The first would be to divide the state up into regions. So if you had 60 MLCs, you could have 6 regions, each electing 10 MLCs. This might be, why might we do this? This might be good for rural and regional New South Wales. If you were here yesterday afternoon, you would have heard Mick Veitch say that for a time he was the only Labor member of Parliament living in, I think it was west of the Great Dividing Range in Queensland or New South Wales or Victoria. So if you've got Labor down to one representative from rural and regional New South Wales, you're probably not representing rural and regional New South Wales terribly well. Now, there can be arguments about how well Labor's ever represented rural areas. I don't want to get into those, but I suspect that, it's a bit hard to represent those regional areas adequately if you only have one representative anywhere in the Parliament. So it might be good for rural and regional New South Wales. It would also increase the quota. If you think about a quota based around electing 10 MLCs for any particular region, that's going to increase your quota from its current level, or more or less double it. And so if you're not a fan of small parties, or parties with small levels of support getting elected to the Parliament, you might like this sort of proposal. It potentially weeds out the kind of parties with very small levels of support. But if we look at Victoria, and I can hear Frank's brain whirring already, which has this sort of regional system, let me read out the names of the parties that are represented in the Legislative Council in Victoria, which uses a regional system, and you might hear some familiar names. The Australian Greens, the Legalised Cannabis Party, the Liberal Democrats, the Animal Justice Party, Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, the Shooters, Farmers and Fishers Party, and an unfamiliar name to us north of the border, except those of us with historical knowledge, the Democratic Labor Party. Most of those names, though, names of parties represented in the Legislative Council of New South Wales currently under the lower quota. So raising the quota doesn't necessarily exclude the sorts of parties we already have in the New South Wales Legislative Council. A second proposal would be to have 20 MLCs elected at each election therefore for 3 terms, for 12-year terms. I'll talk to you later. We can work on this. This would give us more diversity, stronger minor parties, arguably. You have more, Anthony Green made the point yesterday that minor parties struggle to expand. Part of the reason they probably struggle to expand is that they rely on one or two members in the Legislative Council. If you have more Greens, for example, they're going to be able to share the work more effectively than if you're relying on one or two. It would lower, it would use roughly the same quota rather. So the quota would increase a couple of percentage points. So probably doing that would not particularly affect the chances of parties of being elected. It would introduce 12-year terms, which some people would see as being too long a time between elections to keep MLCs accountable, but you would get a relatively stable, if that's your interest, to a relatively stable legislative council over time. The third option would be to keep the current 8-year terms and elect 30 MLCs statewide. This will give you more diversity because there will be a lower quota, 3.23% rather than the current roughly 4.55%. There'll presumably be a bit more diversity. There'll be stronger representation of minor parties. Would there be too much diversity? I ran some numbers on the train coming in this morning. And the results, if we look at the last New South Wales election and we map them on to a quota of 3.23, you don't get terribly much change in the outcome. So the Labor Party would, under a 30-seat MLC election, would have got 11 seats. The Liberal National Party's 9. The Greens would have got 9, possibly 10. The Greens would have got 2, possibly 3. One Nation would have got 1, possibly 2. Legalised cannabis 1. Liberal Democrats 1. And then shooters, farmers and fishers would probably have got 1, animal justice would have got 1, and there would have been a lottery, as there always is, for the last seat. So not a particularly different outcome from the 2023 election. So there are 3 options for you. If you want to do it, I think it can be done in different ways. And these different ways emphasise different strengths and different features of the current Legislative Council. What are the barriers? If I was teaching this as a class, I'd divide you up into 2 halves and say you have to come up with arguments for this, you have to come up for arguments against this proposal, but let's just skip to the chase. I think there are cultural and ideological barriers, obviously. The idea that there are too many parliamentarians already, too many politicians, you can't trust them, they don't work hard, they're just there for the money, etc., etc. If you're a sitting member or a member of the public who talks with other members of the public, you'll know that these arguments are very common. There's also the kind of what I like to think of as the magic number barrier, that once you have a number, 42 in the case of the current Legislative Council, it sort of takes on a mythical or magical status that if you fiddle around with it somehow, the world will fall apart. It would probably surprise people to know how much the numbers of in the Legislative Council and the Legislative Assembly have actually changed over time, and the reasons for which they've changed. There are clearly constitutional and institutional barriers, so the parties would start worrying about their advantages and disadvantages of any change. There'd be a lot of haggling and negotiation around that. And then, of course, I think under the, if Anne Toomey were here, she could step in at this point, but I think under the manner and form provisions of the New South Wales Constitution, there would have to be a referendum, and it would perhaps face a difficult task, given what we heard yesterday from Anthony about the slogan presented as the question to the people for the last reduction in numbers in the Legislative Council of, do you want fewer politicians? That's a very powerful argument in Australia, sadly. So what are some winning arguments? I think winning arguments for more MLCs, more diversity of representation, more capacity for legislative scrutiny, more capacity for executive accountability. I mean, Mark Latham was talking yesterday at some length on and off about this during the MLC's panel and saying, well, MLCs should write their own committee reports. If you want to take that seriously, I think you need more MLCs given the number of reports they'll be writing. But more broadly, if you want, the executive and all the things that it does now in New South Wales that it didn't used to do, if you want to keep it accountable, then you need more MLCs to serve on those many committees that I outlined before in order to achieve that. I think another argument in favour of expanding the Legislative Council is MP envy. So the envy of the members of the Legislative Assembly. If you expand the numbers of the Legislative Council, the Legislative Assembly isn't going to let you do that unless you also expand its own numbers, I don't think. And this would be a good thing. I think it would allow for better geographic and community representation in New South Wales than we have at the moment, with a very high, historically high ratio of population to members of the Legislative Assembly. As I said before, obviously means of communication between constituents and the general public and their representatives in this place have changed over time, but my sense is that the connection between members of Parliament and their communities is not as strong as it should be in a healthy democracy, and that's not the fault of MPs. MPs work very, very hard by and large, and they, I know Peter Phelps was sort of dissing MPs and their work in the community yesterday, but that work in the community is a very important part of their role, and of course it feeds into the accountability role and the legislative role. Communities are more complicated than they once were. The needs of communities are varied. The things that communities want to have a say in are quite varied, and it's more difficult to do that if you're one representative for a geographic community that's suddenly become much larger in the case of rural and regional New South Wales, geographically, but also much larger in population terms for everybody, and more diverse for everybody who's attempting as a parliamentarian to represent a community. So I think more MLCs and more MPs would make for a better Parliament all round. And now I'll put my helmet on and invite questions from you in response to my modest proposal. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rodney, for that incredibly thought-provoking presentation. We now have questions, both from the audience here live and also those online as well. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We have 2 roving mics, which are going around now, and one of the attendants will come and give you the microphone, and we'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible. First question here.
Thank you. I don't know who first said it, but democracy is an ideal which we strive for, and we can never actually attain a perfect democracy, but it is worth continuing to seek to improve the system. So I support you making these proposals, but I completely agree with you. I think it would be difficult to get it through a referendum, and something that would be much easier to get through a referendum would be to actually looking back at the Legislative Council. What were the first Legislative Council was 5 people, and it included the colonies, I think it's called Attorney General, the legal officer. Oh no, sorry, it was the judge, the Supreme Court judge or whatever, the judge, or they didn't have a Supreme Court, the judge, and there was a treasurer, and there was the medical superintendent, at least those 3, and then I think the head of the deputy and the military contingent or whatever. And they were advising the governor. I think there would be much more support for direct democracy where we actually have an opportunity to elect the Premier and 4 senior ministers which one would have the economic portfolio, the Treasury, one would have a legal and security portfolio, the Attorney General, one would have a social security portfolio, education, health, etc. And then the fifth would probably be an infrastructure minister. And there would be a lot of community support, I suspect, for the ability to elect those 5 positions, and it'll be a lot cheaper than expanding both the Parliaments, the Assembly and the Council. And then obviously there'd have to be junior ministers under them that would be selected from the parliamentarians. But it's just a thought. I don't know if you've got any views on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I've understood the proposal. So is the proposal to abolish the Legislative Council?
No. You keep the 2 councils. Basically, you elect the 5 ministers, the Premier and 4 senior portfolios. They are the senior ministers as a sort of an inner cabinet.
Okay.
And then you have,
And they wouldn't sit in the Parliament.
Well, they would
They-
have a government. So again, it's a multi-party government because you wouldn't have them all from the same party. So it's like, yes, the federal system seeks to enforce a 2-party system. New South Wales has a good electoral system which does not seek to enforce a 2-party system. This would be going a step further, going towards a multi-party cabinet.
Okay. I think well, it would depend on the electoral mechanism whether you get a single-party cabinet or not. You couldn't. There's no guarantee that you would get a multi-party cabinet.
And that's good if you do.
Anyway, I mean, it's an interesting proposal. I don't think it addresses the executive accountability issue that I was raising. I don't think it addresses the legislative review issue that I was raising. I mean, I'm open to let's talk more about it. But as a proposal, I think it would not address those 2 elements of legislative activity, which I see are important for the Parliament, and I don't think the Parliament can as adequately do with its current numbers as it could if it were expanded. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Rodney. I must admit, I'm horrified at the idea of there being 121 MLAs. Disclaimer, I work for an MLA, so my boss might kill me for saying this, but I do think 93 is enough. So 2 questions. The first is, and you've touched upon it, could we increase the numbers for the Legislative Council without increasing numbers for the Assembly? Because I certainly agree 42 Legislative Councillors isn't enough. But if we're going to increase members of the Assembly, should we consider the New Zealand model of a multi-part MMP system where constituents have 2 votes, one for a local member and the other for a party of government? I'm not advocating one way or the other.
Good questions. Yeah, you could. Of course, you could increase the number of MLCs without increasing the number of MLAs. 2 observations about that. I think it would be difficult in the sense that the MLAs might, see themselves as having a status that would require them to have roughly double the number of MLCs, which is kind of the pattern in most parliaments in Australia, where there are 2 houses. That's the first observation. The second one is, you could introduce MMP, and it is used in some bicameral parliaments like Germany, but in the New Zealand case it was introduced to deal with a unicameral parliament where the upper house had been abolished decades before, and so it was to deal with the fact that under the electoral system, governments won, think Queensland, governments won huge majorities, and then there was relatively little break on them if they wanted to put in place their mandate, which is, 2 of my students argued, is as it should be. The people decide, the government gets in, it has its majority in the single house, and it, off it goes. And then 4 years later or 3 years later, you have another chance to throw them out or confirm them. I think the argument for MMP has less force, proportionality has less force in the lower house when you have such a proportional upper house. And I think you really want to focus the Legislative Assembly's role on representation of geographic constituencies. And so is that being done adequately now with 93? Perhaps, but I think there's a case that says, you can expand the number of MLAs to better represent the diversity of our large state.
Yeah, there's a lady here.
I just noticed that in your final proposals, you didn't mention again the Indigenous representation possibility. And I wondered, what are the difficulties? There are obvious difficulties, of course, but, whether you talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it is difficult. So there are a number of possibilities here. One is the South Australian /ACT model, which is to establish effectively a voice, an assembly for First Nations peoples that sits outside the current parliamentary structure and advises the Parliament and or the Executive. So that model is currently underway in South Australia, early days. It's been in place without much hoo-ha in the much smaller jurisdiction of the ACT. That's a possibility. It was a possibility that was being talked about before the failure of the referendum in 2023. Another possibility that was talked about earlier, there was actually I believe it was the Legislative Council Committee, or it might have been a joint committee, looked into this in around about 1998 from memory in New South Wales, and concluded that there wasn't a practical reason for establishing dedicated seats for First Nations peoples, or Aboriginal people in New South Wales. So it's another possibility. You could introduce dedicated seats. Now, one of the attractions, I did think about this, but I thought, bridge too far, but I'll cross that bridge now. One of the attractions, if you like the idea of dedicated seats for First Nations peoples in New South Wales, is if you have more MLAs, I think you would do it in the Legislative Assembly, and you would do it for the reason that the electoral system is more amenable to that. So under the Legislative Assembly rules, electorates have to be roughly equal in terms of population. So one way of doing this would be to adopt New Zealand's approach, which would be to have a kind of an overlay of First Nations seats over the state, which would have the same number of electors in each electorate as for the general electorates. This would be easier to do with a larger assembly because there are more seats. So each seat requires a lower population, and from memory, the First Nations population of New South Wales is roughly 4%, 3 to 4%. So if you think about 3 to 4% of the seats, that gives you a few seats to work with, a few more seats to work with. Indigenous electors could choose, as in the system with the Maori seats in the 7 Maori seats in New Zealand, Aotearoa in New Zealand, to be on the Maori roll, or in this case the First Nations roll, or whatever they want to call it, or the general roll. So the number of seats would vary according to that. But so it's complicated, but it can be done. So that's another possibility. Or, and there are arguments either way. I mean, I think probably one of the strongest arguments that Noel Pearson made for the voice was that if you're a 3% mouse, I'm using his words here, in other words, if you're 3% of the population, if you're 3% mouse, you're always going to be stamped on by a 97% elephant, the rest of us who are, immigrant settlers here in Australia, so in New South Wales. So the argument, and this was again something that the committee that looked into this in the late 1990s concluded, from memory Meredith Bergman chaired that committee, was that dedicated seats, while they sound like a good idea, the occupants of those seats may well, their impact may well be dissipated in the broader relationships that, partisanship, et cetera, in the chamber. But certainly worth considering. Thanks for raising it. Yeah.
Yeah, gentleman here.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm just a bit put off by the statistics you're looking at. You don't seem to mention that maybe we could slow down the growth of the number of people and we won't need it. Because otherwise you project the figures you've got here now in 100 years' time and you're going to need another 2 to 3 floors on top of this parliament. Has anybody maybe contemplated that population is expanding far too rapidly for us to have some sort of representation in it? You know, it can't go on. You know, and I would point out that back 1824, for whatever, well, certainly by 1888, the parliament we had there, where Sydney and Melbourne ranked in the top 5% of countries around the world. So whatever we were doing did seem to work pretty well. And now as a self-funded retiree and sort of look at a lot of public servants on the teat, I don't hear you saying what the expense would be of adding these people as well and all the people that be with them. But surely it would be far better for us to try to slow our bloody population down and keep a better hold on it rather than this headlong run. Yep, thanks.
Yep, that's a good comment. I mean, I'm not projecting the population to grow. You know, the population could be stable now, and I think the case for the increase in the number of parliamentarians for the current population, even if we hold it to what it is now, is a good one. There are limits. I mean, if you look at the Indian Parliament, I don't have these figures, but I did work them out for my students. They're on a slide somewhere on my computer. You know, each member of the Lok Sabha represents millions of people. How is that possible? One answer to that is, of course, India, like Australia, is a federation. So one response to the limits to population growth would be to divide states again. Wow, we're really talking now radical change, aren't we? Or to devolve more powers to councils. Again, not a happy argument in this sort of forum context, given the long-standing antagonism between state and local governments in New South Wales. But yeah, I mean, you are right. Increasing population does bring with it not just the challenges that I'm sure really lie behind your question about sustainability, et cetera, but they do bring political challenges. So yeah, that's certainly something that needs to be considered. But I would say, even if we froze the population now, you know, what did Bob Carr say famously? New South Wales is full. Even if we sort of if we adopt that stance, there's still a case for increasing the number of parliamentarians. But I suspect what also lies behind your argument is the size of government more generally, and you might want that reduced, in which case what I'm saying is a bad idea for you. Yeah.
Yeah, Noah.
Similar-ish question to one we had before, but less looking at specific like Indigenous seats, but more looking generally on how the increase of numbers to the Parliament do you think that would increase the representation just through the nature of there being more people representing the general population in New South Wales of those groups, such as First Nations people who have been historically underrepresented from members of Parliament? I think there's only been 2 or 3. I think there's been 3 members of the both the upper and lower house in New South Wales who have ever been First Nations people, which is, I think, one of the lowest around the countries.
Yeah, so you kind of answered your question. You can't assume that it will naturally occur. So yes, the New South Wales Parliament does have a record of low representation by identified First Nations peoples. It's slightly higher than 2 or 3, but it's not much higher historically. You know, I mean, I guess Linda Burney is the most well-known example of that. Yeah, so it doesn't happen automatically. I mean, if you think about The Chinese Australian community, that's another good example where it hasn't happened naturally. You know, there's very large growth in the Chinese Australian community or Indian Australian community. Will that be reflected in the Parliament? I don't think there's a natural process there. I mean, after all, women made up 50% of the population in New South Wales for a long time before there was anywhere near parity. So it has to be a deliberate effort. Now, parties can do that. As you know, parties have taken the lead in, you know, increasing the gender balance in the Parliament with varying degrees of success. But it doesn't happen naturally. Someone has to do it. The parties can do it, or you can have mechanisms. You know, there's a case for specific dedicated seats, which rests not on diversity but indigeneity, you know, First Nation status. So that's why, you know, I think the kind of focus on that is important. But it won't happen naturally, is my observation from the historical record. Yep.
Time for one very quick question. Yep, gentleman here. And then we'll have to wrap up.
Thank you. Rodney, a point you made was that the committee system's central to the council's ability to do its oversight role, and they're struggling to do that effectively because insufficient number of MPs. Therefore, the solution is increase the number of MPs. What about alternative ways of bringing resources into the committee system without increasing the number of MPs? Perhaps experts of various types, guys with resources, training, expertise in the particular areas the committees are looking at, perhaps on a non-voting or, you know, sort of secondary level. Might that address the problem without needing to go to the people to have the number of MPs increased?
Yeah, I don't think I said the Legislative Council was doing a bad job. I think I meant that it wasn't doing, you know, perhaps the job that it could do. Yeah, and I think, yes, I mean, that's a good suggestion, but then committees do that. I mean, they do draw on expertise. You know, that's what all submissions are, and the expert witnesses and so on. But MLCs ultimately, or members of Parliament more broadly, ultimately have to take responsibility for the committee reports. They're responsible for them. They're the ones who produce the reports. I mean, you could certainly engage. You know, there'd be a number of ways of engaging the public, and the Legislative Council has moved in this direction. You know, virtual committee hearings in the community, not expecting everyone to come down to Macquarie Street to appear in front of the committee. I think some, you know, translation into different languages. I think in one or two committees. Certainly, experts are encouraged to participate in those committees, and their if you read the reports, their input is treated very seriously. So you could expand that as you're suggesting. Yeah, that's a suggestion. But I think ultimately the Legislative Councillors have to be the ones. You know, I think Mark Latham made this point pretty well yesterday. I know he's sometimes not taken as seriously as he might be, but, you know, I think it was a very serious point that it's the, you know, Legislative Councillors who ultimately have the responsibility to produce good reports, to ensure that the committees work effectively, and they can certainly be helped by that outside expertise, but you're still going to need, I think, you know, it still would be valuable to have more MLCs to share that work around. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you to everyone who asked a question and contributed, and thank you, Professor Smith, again, a very insightful presentation and Q&A on our second day here. So please thank Professor Rodney Smith.